Sales tax was down, I say only 6.4%. It's really the first time the sales tax declined since we had tax reform, but it was in March, so it was March activity. We expected a little bit bigger decline than we got, but it was 6.4%. Total withholding was down 7.5%, but regular withholding was flat. So on the economic front, things were maybe not as bad as maybe we thought they might be. The bigger differences in April were what I call the potential timing or policy effects. And the total difference of all the stuff that could be related to policy or timing was $331 million, of which $181.7 million was from declaration payments or estimated payments, and 149.3 of it was related to net returns. There's a big difference on timing, whether you're talking about net returns or declarations. Net returns represent tax year 2009 activity, which was all pre-COVID. So in terms of whether that money is going to come back after the due date change, I would say that I have a higher degree of confidence that the net returns are going to come back. Declarations or estimated payments are forward-looking, meaning that you're paying into a liability that you think you'll owe from 2020 activity. That's 181.7 million, and since 2020 activity is up in the air a little bit, to me, there's a different probability that we'll get that money back. And speaking of getting it back, as I'm sure you're aware, on March 20th, 2020, Governor Beshear mirrored the federal government in delaying the filing deadlines for 3 months from April 15th to July 15th. Senate Bill 150 was enacted to reinforce the COVID-19 actions by the governor, and it was signed on March 30th, 2020. And the things in particular that we have to be aware of is that in Senate Bill 150, the final returns date was changed from April 15th to July 15th, and also the estimated payments due dates. For calendar year filers, individuals and corporations have to make estimated payments on April 15th and June 15th, and those are now due July 15th. So you're probably thinking July 15th, that's beyond fiscal year 20. So why are we so worried about it? Well, what we're going to do on those returns and declaration payments that come in before July 15th, there's a soft close process for the state, and we're going to follow 10 specific revenue codes and journal voucher the money back to fiscal 20 for the money that comes in early July that's related to the delayed payments. So even though the money comes in July, it'll be booked to fiscal 20. And that's going to be key on individual and corporate as to how much of that money comes in, and so look forward to that in the presentations. Finally, before I turn it over to Michael, talk about April 2020 road fund receipts. They were down 30.1%, which is a nominal decline of 43.9%. Fuels dropped $7.5 million or 11.8%, but April receipts are March activity. So, part of March was going as normal, and so we expected a decline, but we didn't expect the full blunt of the decline since it was March activity. Motor vehicle usage, on the other hand, is April receipts or April activity. So they fell 60.1% or $29.9 million in the month of April. And finally, license and privilege taxes fell 20.2%, and Gene will go over these numbers in more detail when we get to the road fund. So with that, those are my opening remarks, and at this time I think it's appropriate to go back to page 1 of your book. I think it's page 1. Yeah, page 1 of your book, and we're gonna go through the national and Kentucky outlooks that we're gonna be using for our control and pessimistic forecast. So I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Michael Jones.
Docs, but we greatly appreciate the focus of everyone. We did change the format of the national and state outlook slightly compared to our normal presentation materials. First, because we're only focusing on the FY20 recast, we are only presenting FY20 and FY21 from IHS Market, or colloquially, as we like to say, Global Insight. The other difference is we are not presenting the optimistic forecast, and we have removed, from our normal presentation materials, we have removed any comparisons versus what was presented at the December meeting. Obviously, as drastically as everything has changed, the slides where we normally talk about the changes from one CFG meeting to the next, that would be unnecessary for this meeting. So what is in the IHS market forecast? The first thing, of course, is that it is unprecedented, the global contraction that is being discussed in the forecast. I'm sorry?
Chris Bollinger has a question, I believe.
Dr. Bollinger?
Perhaps you're going to cover this, but I didn't see it when I brief glanced through the slide. Why aren't we looking at the optimistic scenario? Which I know my colleagues are going to be surprised that I'm asking this, but I'm just curious why the decision to not even present the optimistic scenario was made. I mean, it's still pretty pessimistic itself.
It is. It's my understanding that the decision was made to help speed along the process to not present or to calculate the optimistic forecast due to the assumptions that were, while you said more pessimistic than a normal optimistic forecast. It's my understanding the decision was made to not include those materials. I can ask Greg to speak more to the actual reasons. I was not privy to those discussions, but that was my understanding. Okay, so what is in the current IHS market forecast, which is part of the underlying structure of this forecast? Again, I feel sorry for the person who had to use their thesaurus to write this. Words like unprecedented, extreme are used very, very often. So again, we know this is an unprecedented global contraction. The efforts to halt the spread of the COVID-19 virus have resulted in both a consumer and business demand side collapse due to the stay-at-home orders, social distancing orders, and overall concerns for individual safety. That, of course, has been paired with a supply chain disruption, as we've seen global trade and the production, inputs to production also be disrupted, including the food sector. We've also seen significant weakness in the energy sector. The Saudi Arabia and Russia price fight over oil has resulted in a historic decline, and of course, everyone saw the news where we saw that there was actually a negative close for oil. Again, not implying that oil is worthless, just implying that finding a place to store the excess oil at this point is extremely difficult with the significant reductions in overall economic activity that oil, of course, is an input to those activities. And in both the control and the pessimistic forecast, the assumption is made that the pandemic will peak and the bottom of the growth fall will occur in the fourth quarter of fiscal 20. They differ in the rate at which they come back, but both the control and the pessimistic forecast assume that the pandemic peaks and growth reaches its nadir in Q4 of FY20. And both assume identical fiscal and monetary policy responses. So everything that has been passed in the CARES Act and the activities announced by the Federal Reserve are assumed to be identical in both forecasts. So the control scenario, which is weighted at a 45% probability, we see GDP contract at a 0.6% rate for fiscal 2020 and a 7% contraction for the entire calendar year of 2020. The control scenario has a 3-quarter recession, which has already begun for the third quarter of fiscal 20. Consumer spending is expected to fall at a 32% annualized rate for this quarter, and business fixed investment also contracts by a 14.7% rate for the remainder of the calendar year. A record number of workers file for unemployment benefits. We've seen approximately 28 million individuals file unemployment claims nationwide. The forecast fully incorporates the CARES Act and the Federal Reserve actions, and Brent oil prices are expected to fall to a low of $11 per barrel for the fourth quarter of fiscal 20 and average $29 per barrel for the rest of this calendar year. The pessimistic scenario is similar as far as the overall time horizon, but it is significantly sharper and deeper in terms of the contraction that is forecasted. Growth, rather than the 0.6 in the control, falls 3% for the remainder of fiscal 2020 and a 20.9% rate for the remainder of this calendar year, I should say. Consumer spending falls at a 60% annualized rate in the next quarter. And from peak to trough, real GDP declines 22.9% in the pessimistic scenario versus the 8.3% peak to trough decline in the control forecast. Manufacturing employment declines by 21.6% versus the 8.9% in the control forecast. And in the pessimistic forecast, the unemployment rate reaches 22.2% by the first quarter of fiscal 21. And so again, while the recession is 3 quarters, in the pessimistic scenario, the overall recovery takes significantly longer to reach the original GDP levels before the beginning of this pandemic. Again, the presentation here is based on the variables. It is a modified, shorter presentation. Again, the optimistic is not on the screen, and we remove the comparisons between the current forecast and what was presented in December. So again, real GDP, always our first slide, shows exactly what is occurring in these forecasts. You can clearly see that the control forecast, what is on the screen here, represents that 0.6% decline for the remainder of this fiscal year, fiscal 20, and an overall 2.6% decline in fiscal 21. Contrast that with the much more severe decline in the pessimistic forecast. For fiscal 20, that's a negative 3%, and for fiscal 21, that is a negative 13.3%. And we see this pattern repeat through the vast majority of the individual variables. U.S. employment, as I mentioned before, we've had 28 million people file for unemployment, and it's not surprising to see the drop-off that is forecasted. Again, in the control scenario, there's a slight increase for the remainder of fiscal 20, but then a 6.9% decline in fiscal 21. That is compared to the pessimistic forecast, which has a 2% decline for fiscal 20 and a 18.3% decline for fiscal 21. The manufacturing sector, obviously the drop-off is much more severe than the overall employment situation. In the control scenario, there's a 0.7% decline in fiscal 20 and an 8.9% decline in fiscal 21. Contrast that with the 2.8% drop-off represented in the pessimistic scenario and a staggering 21.6% decline for fiscal 21 in manufacturing employment. Real personal income, the control, relatively positive at 2.2% to the positive for fiscal 20, and then a very slight 0.1% decline for fiscal 21. However, in the pessimistic scenario, it's a slight increase for the remainder of fiscal 20 at 0.4, but then an 8.4% decline in fiscal 21. So again, a significant difference between the control and the pessimistic forecast. Real consumer spending, I mentioned this earlier. Again, I should have brought my thesaurus. There's hard to come up with enough words to describe what the pessimistic is saying. But here we see in the control forecast, a relatively small 1.3% decline, followed by a slight gain for fiscal 21 of 1.8%. But in the pessimistic, it's a negative 4.7% for the remainder of this fiscal year, and for fiscal 21, a negative 14% in consumer expenditures. Durable goods, often we associate, of course, with manufacturing, strong point of Kentucky, and we see here that in the control forecast, a 0.8% decline for the remainder of 20, but then a 1.3% decline overall for fiscal 21, compared with a 6.9% decline in the pessimistic forecast for fiscal 20 overall, and a negative 18.6% decline in the pessimistic forecast. In the consumption of gasoline and oil, of course, this is in dollars. We know that there has been a significant decline. However, the decline in prices have not been able to make up for the usage that has fallen off due to the change in travel, especially air and, of course, traditional commercial vehicle travel. We see that in both forecasts, strong negative declines in the overall forecast of consumption of gasoline and oil. In the control, a 12.9% decline for fiscal 20 and a 16.9% decline for fiscal 21, whereas in the pessimistic forecast, there's a 17.3% forecast decline in fiscal 20 with a 36.3% decline for fiscal 21. And another variable we associate, of course, with Kentucky manufacturing, sales of light vehicles, with the restrictions on the availability of parts, shut down for plants, and of course restrictions on the retail operations of vehicles. Significant declines have occurred and are being forecast. In the control forecast for fiscal 20, a 13.6% decline, with a 2.7% decline in the following fiscal year 21. However, in the pessimistic forecast, a 22.1% decline in the remainder for fiscal 20 and a 21.7% decline in fiscal 21. Now again, that was an abbreviated number of slides for our variables for the national economy, but again, we did want to move things along. However, of course, we have the IHS market books here. If anyone has any questions about any of the variables we normally present, or any of the variables that have been presented, I would be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I will move on to the Kentucky economic outlook. Okay, hearing none, here is our Kentucky non-farm employment model from the Kentucky MAC model. We can see that for...
Dr. Jones?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Dr. Bartley has a question.
Yes, sir, Dr. Bartley.
Yes, thank you. And I apologize if I'm jumping the gun here, but it seems like we're getting away from the national. All of these projections you just gave us, if I read the notes correctly, these are from, you're using IHS Markets April numbers, is that right?
That is correct.
And just a couple of, like 1 or 2 days ago, we got something for May. I don't know if later in the presentation, but if not, if now you could tell us just your quick 2 cents about how if we're looking at numbers from April, how the IHS market for May, to me, looked slightly more pessimistic, but I don't know if you're going to get to that later, but if not, if you could just tell us briefly the difference between the two.
I would be happy to. I will say that we do not plan to discuss that later. However, in anticipation, I did make comparisons for all of the normal variables between the April to May. If there's a specific variable that you're interested in, I would be happy to show you that slide. However, since that data was not available to the team doing the forecasting work, we decided that it would not be appropriate to present those slides. But I can tell you that overall, the control forecast for May is slightly more pessimistic, and the pessimistic forecast is slightly more optimistic. However, there are some variables where the change in the control forecast is a relatively significant change. For example, just in GDP alone, whereas the April IHS market forecast for fiscal 20 was a negative 0.6%, it is negative 1.6% in the May forecast. That pattern is repeated for the vast majority of the variables, but if there's any variable in particular you would like to ask about, I would be happy to show you the graph, or I can tell you the numbers. But overall, that seems to be that in May, IHS market became more pessimistic in the control, but slightly more optimistic relative to the April in the pessimistic forecast.
That's a fine summary for now from me. Thank you.
Okay, and if any variables come up later that need to be discussed, we would be happy to address those because, as I said, I do have that data here if need be. Returning to the slides, this is the Kentucky non-farm employment slide. The control forecast has a very slight decline for fiscal 20 at 0.8%, but a negative 5.9% decline in fiscal 21. Compare that, of course, to the pessimistic. The red line shows that is a 2.5% decline in fiscal 20 and a 15.2% decline in fiscal 21. We saw the total unemployment rate was published today of 15.4% for Kentucky for the month of April. And we've alluded to the unemployment claims. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But again, employment, there's no doubt that in the pessimistic forecast, significant declines in unemployment for the remainder, for fiscal 20 overall, the remaining quarter of this fiscal year and fiscal 21. Here we compare what the model compares the United States with Kentucky. You can see that overall in the control forecast, Kentucky is forecasted to do slightly better than the U.S. economy as a whole when it comes to non-farm employment, at a 5.9% decline in fiscal 21 versus the 6.9% for the U.S. as a whole. However, for the near term, for fiscal 20, whereas the United States in the forecast has a slight gain, we do have a decline of 0.8%. So in the near term, we're a little worse off than the United States economy as a whole, versus in 21 when we're slightly better under the control forecast. Manufacturing employment, again, a major concern in Kentucky. In the control forecast, a 2.5% decline for fiscal 20 and a 10.9% decline for fiscal 21. Compare that with the pessimistic, which is slightly more pessimistic in the near term at 3.4% decline for fiscal 20, but significantly more pessimistic for fiscal 21 at a 22.8% decline, which is what is represented here by the red line. Again, we see that in this case, in both for fiscal 20 and for fiscal 21, we are significantly worse off than the U.S. economy as a whole when it comes to manufacturing employment, with a 2.5% and 10.9% decline overall compared to the U.S. as a whole's 0.7% and 8.9% decline respectively in fiscal 20 and 21. Here's personal income. We've seen the release of the census flash survey. We know that in the first 2 weeks, which represented the last 2 weeks of April, approximately 47.5% and 46.9% of Kentucky households have reported declines in personal income. Here's the forecast for personal income. In the control forecast, slight gain for fiscal 20 overall at 3.9, and then a decline of 0.8% in fiscal 21. However, in the pessimistic forecast, lower gains in the near term of 1.3% for fiscal 20, but then an 11.7% decline in personal income for fiscal 21. Compared to the U.S. as a whole, in the near term, slightly better than the U.S. economy as a whole, 3.9 versus 3.5% for fiscal 20. But unfortunately, again, in fiscal 21, we have a inverse dichotomy here of a negative 0.8% for the Kentucky forecast based on the control forecast versus 0.8 to the good for the U.S. economy as a whole. Here's Kentucky wages and salaries. Again, a more extreme version of the personal income overall. We have a 1.3% gain for fiscal 20, followed by a 9.6% decline in the control forecast for fiscal 21. Whereas in the pessimistic forecast, fiscal 20 will be a negative 3.5% decline and a 28.8% decline in Kentucky wages and salaries for fiscal 21 in the pessimistic forecast. So very pessimistic. Compared to the U.S. as a whole, again, in this case, we are worse off than the U.S. economy as a whole in the control forecast at 1.3% versus 2.1% for the U.S. as a whole for fiscal 20, and a negative 9.6% decline versus 4.1% decline for fiscal 21 compared to the economy, the U.S. economy as a whole. We did not spend much time on transfer payments in December, and we thought it would be good to go in a little bit more in depth than we did in December, since obviously there's going to be a significant amount when it comes to transfer payments and changes in transfer payments relative to what we had discussed previously. However, as you can see in the MAC model, there is almost no difference between the pessimistic and the control forecast when it comes to the increase in the transfer payments as a portion of income for Kentucky. In the control forecast, it's an 11.4% gain for fiscal 20 and a 13% increase for fiscal 21. The pessimistic forecast is identical for fiscal 20 at 11.4% again, with a slightly larger increase as would be expected. In a pessimistic forecast, we would expect transfer income to increase 13.5% gain in fiscal 21 versus the 13% assumed in the control forecast. Again, these slides were put in. It's the only time we're making the comparison to what was presented in December, because again, we didn't talk about transfers much in December, and you can see relative for 20 and 21, significant gains in the portion of Kentucky citizens' income that is expected to be in the form of transfer payments. Again, not much of a difference between the control and the pessimistic forecast for transfer payments. Again, 11.4% in both cases, and a very slight difference, 13 versus 13.5% increase for fiscal 21. This is a new slide. We've never done this before, but given these unprecedented natures, I just want to speak just for a moment about Kentucky unemployment insurance claims. The slide that is in your booklet, of course, to have everything done and prepared and printed, at that time, it represented since mid-March 670,000 unemployment claims. As we sit here today, we are at slightly over 850,000 unemployment claims in Kentucky. That is approximately 40% of the workforce in terms of claims. Now, there is an issue, of course, continued claims. That's the number of the people actually receiving unemployment checks. So while we have had approximately 850,000 people file for unemployment, we currently have approximately 250,000 people receiving checks. So there's a significant gap between the number of claims and the number of people receiving them. We have transmitted between the federal enhanced payments and Kentucky unemployment insurance payments. From mid-March to now, we have transmitted approximately $1.5 billion to those people in Kentucky who are facing unemployment or reduced employment. To put that in perspective, during the Great Recession, it took us 16 months to pay out $1.5 billion in payments. So again, slightly different, not a forecast. This is just showing you where we are at this point. Yes, Ms. Karen.
Dr. Fernandez asked if this is the largest percentage in the union per population, correct?
Yes, that has been reported by numerous agencies. The different rating agencies have pointed this out, and several other people have pointed out that Kentucky does have the highest percentage of its employment. Also, I should specify, I mentioned earlier that we now know that April had a total unemployment rate of 15.4%. This is the insured unemployment rate. This is a special unemployment rate. This is the percentage of people who could potentially receive unemployment. Not everyone who works in the economy is normally allowed to receive unemployment. So you can see here the most recent data that was provided to the group. 13.5% of the people eligible for unemployment were receiving unemployment payments.
Thank you. And also, Dr. Bollinger would like to ask a question too.
Yes, sir, Dr. Bollinger.
So there was a report on NPR this morning that at least the state of Washington is finding really large numbers of fraudulent claims. Basically, there's some more criminal organization that's filing fraudulent claims using stolen identities. Do we have any sense if that's playing a role in this 800,000 number that you're giving us? And then the other thing is, given the lag that I understand is there, and understandably so, in sort of getting payments out, could part of that 800,000 that you're citing be people who have filed a second time because they didn't get a check yet?
There is certainly the possibility. Well, let me address the first question first. I do not want to speak authoritatively on exactly what the Division of Unemployment Insurance has experienced. I know that all state unemployment insurance programs have had issues with people using either information obtained through, the word escaped my mind, when a data breach. Data breach information has been used by criminal organizations to try to file for unemployment. It is my understanding that while some of that has occurred, our system has been good at identifying when a claim is fraudulent. Now, it does slow the process down, but it is my understanding that we have not fallen victim Certainly nowhere near the scale that has been reported in other states. But have there been attempts? Yes, but I could not tell you the magnitude. There is a delay in terms of people filing, and sometimes people very often are frustrated. They're concerned that they have not yet received a payment for their unemployment, and they will file again. While I'm sure there is some of that, I do not believe that it could make up more than a modicum of a percentage of the total number of people who have filed. People are sternly told filing again when you have a claim can cause both of your claims to be ejected from the system. So while I'm sure some people have, I certainly don't believe it could be more than a 5% or less of the overall number of claims. But that is my personal belief from my work in the unemployment system, and that is not based on any information that they have provided me at this point.
Okay, thank you.
You're absolutely welcome. Are there any questions concerning any of the national or Kentucky slides? Given the different format here, I will be moving away from the desk. We can always come back, but now would be the time to ask if anyone has any specific questions concerning these or any of the other variables we normally present. Hearing none, I will thank everyone for their time. Oh,
Sorry, Dr. Johnson does.
yes, Dr. Johnson.
Yes. Yes. So in talking about the unemployment rates, one of the variables in that is the labor force participation rate, which has taken a dive nationally.
Yes.
Do we know by how much the labor force participation rate has fallen in Kentucky?
We do not know that at this point. That data has not been published to my knowledge.
Okay. The reason I ask is because if it has fallen, then that would understate the unemployment rate that's reported.
Yes. That is a very important point, as of course is the traditional measure of unemployment. You have to be available for work, and there is a question of if someone is caring for a sick relative or someone else who has needs that would require them to withdraw from the labor force. There's a question of how people answer the survey questions, of course, and many people are reporting that they are being furloughed rather than truly are unemployed. They're expecting to be recalled. So you're correct. There's an issue with who is in the labor force, what form are they in the labor force, and what form of unemployment are they currently experiencing? Is it a furlough, or have they been let go and separated from their employer? So you're correct. There is a potential that these numbers overall are understated. If there's no other questions, I appreciate everyone's time, and I hope everyone stays safe.
This is Thomas Jones. Let's move on to individual income tax. You can see here the last 3 quarters of the individual income tax receipts. Each quarter, individual performed better and better. The third quarter was extraordinarily good with strong withholding, declarations, net returns, all performing very well. The withholding if you focus on the quarter 3 information for a moment, withholding growth in quarter 3 was extremely large. And that was largely a result of a favorable calendar. In January of 2020, that was a 5-Friday month, while in January of 2019, there were only 4 Fridays, so we received an extra withholding payment from all of the firms that make their withholding payments. The reverse was true in March. In March of 2020, but the holiday employment in January is higher, and therefore we received more withholding payments in January relative to March. So on net, we received more money for the whole third quarter. For the whole third quarter. Despite the fewer paydays in March of 2020, March withholding was still plus 3%. You would expect the intuitively, you would think the reverse would be true, but March withholding was so strong on an economic basis that the net withholding in March was plus 3% over the previous year. So it was indeed a strong quarter for third quarter withholding. Declarations was solid across all three quarters. The negative growth rate in quarter three for net returns, that represents growth because that's a negative number divided by a negative number. So the negative 17% actually represents an improvement in our position for net returns. Fiscal 19 quarter three was negative $183 million, and so we improved to negative $152 million. So from the Commonwealth's perspective, we were $31.3 million better off. And you can see that the year-to-date totals in the right column, individual year-to-date was plus 5.2% growth rate. In April of 2020, everything sort of reversed itself. Withholding fell by 7.5% in April, and I believe that was sort of half the month was operations as usual, and half the month was the beginning of the strong decline, some of which you saw Michael speak about. As numerous industries were required to shut down, that started in approximately the end of March 20th to 26th. Many declarers did not make their April payment, as Greg mentioned. We received just a fraction of the normal April payment amount. This was expected as the due date was delayed until July 15th, and that's when we expect to receive the majority of the declarations payments for this quarter. For net returns, we saw pretty much normal behavior for filing for quarter three. That is, most people who wanted a refund and filed in quarter three, they received their refunds in their third quarter like they usually do. And the majority of people who still owe on their return have delayed their payments until July the 15th. We expect that money to be filed in the fourth quarter. As of 2 weeks ago, there was 220,000 returns less have been filed this year relative to last year. So there's still quite a few returns that are outstanding and we're waiting for them. Fiduciary is technically a returns payment, but it's for trusts and estates. Those pay returns have also been delayed. So the payment that we usually get in fiduciary in April, we're expecting that in July as well. The normal April payment for declarations, net returns, and fiduciary expected to be delayed until July the 15th, as I mentioned. The Kentucky Department of Revenue has assured us that that processing money will be put into the fourth quarter bucket. Withholdings and declarations payments are contemporaneous in the sense that the payments are based on current quarter economic activities, and therefore we expect significant declines in those two revenue categories due to the business shutdowns. While net returns and fiduciary are payments based on tax year 2019 economic activity and should be largely immune to the economic shutdown effects, except for the delay in payments, as I mentioned. A very small amount of normal money that is collected between July 1 and July the 15th that would normally not go into the fourth quarter 2020 bucket, this year will go into the 2020 bucket. However, it's usually a very small amount. Historically, it's between $3 million and $3.3 million if you go back and look over the last 5 years. Each month in the fourth quarter has the same number of Fridays as the same month last year, so this is not an issue looking forward. So I'll go over some of my methodology for this forecast. The withholding control, this is not the model that I used in the past for the